Margaret stood on the weathered porch of her beach house, breathing in the salt air she'd loved for 40 years.
At 72, she still felt the same flutter of joy when the ocean breeze lifted her silver-streaked hair. This house held every precious memory of her marriage to William, their laughter, their quiet mornings with coffee, their evening walks along the shore. William had been gone 3 years now.
The grief had softened, but the loneliness remained sharp. Her son Daniel had married Rebecca 5 years ago. Margaret had welcomed her warmly, hoping for the daughter she'd never had. But Rebecca was different than Margaret expected. Cold, calculating,
Always watching Margaret with those sharp green eyes.
as if measuring her worth. This weekend, Margaret had driven down to the beach house for some peace.
She needed the ocean's wisdom, its endless patience.
She'd brought fresh flowers for the porch and William's favorite jazz records. But when she pulled into the gravel driveway,
3 cars were already parked there. Her stomach tightened through the large windows.
she could see people moving inside her home. Children running, adults laughing.
Rebecca's entire family had taken over her sanctuary. Margaret took a slow breath.
She gathered her overnight bag and walked to the front door.
It was unlocked.
She stepped inside. The living room was chaos.
Rebecca's parents sat on Margaret's sofa. Her sister sprawled across William's favorite chair. 3 children she didn't recognize were jumping on the furniture, their shoes leaving marks on the cushions. Rebecca appeared from the kitchen, holding a wine glass.
When she saw Margaret, her face hardened. Why did that old Leech show up here?
Rebecca said loudly, her voice cutting through the noise. Everyone stopped,
Turned, stared at Margaret.
"We don't have space for you." The words hit like a physical blow. Margaret stood perfectly still. She looked at Rebecca, at her son Daniel, who stood behind his wife, saying nothing.
Doing nothing.
His silence hurt worse than Rebecca's cruelty. "This is my house," Margaret said quietly. "Actually," Rebecca said, stepping closer with a smile that did reach her eyes, "Daniel owns it now."
You signed it over last year, remember?
For estate planning?
Margaret remembered.
Daniel had seemed so concerned about taxes, about protecting the family assets.
She trusted him.
Trusted them both. "I signed it over for after I am gone," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands.
This is still my home. Rebecca laughed. A cold, brittle sound. Well, we're using it this weekend.
"You will have to find somewhere else to stay. Maybe a hotel?"
The children had stopped jumping. Even they sensed something terrible happening. Margaret looked at her son.
"Daniel?"
He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stood there. This man she'd raised, whose scraped knees she'd bandaged, whose tears she'd dried. Standing silent while his wife humiliated his mother, Margaret smiled then. A genuine smile that confused Rebecca. "It's okay, dear," Margaret said softly. She set down her bag. "I understand perfectly now." She turned and walked out. She sat in her car for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing. Not crying, not yet. Just breathing and thinking. She'd spent her whole life being kind, being accommodating,
Being the bigger person.
Where had it gotten her? Standing on the porch of her own home, being called a leech by the woman her son chose over her. Margaret started the engine and drove, but she didn't go far. She went to see Eleanor,
Her oldest friend, who lived 2 blocks from the beach.
Eleanor had been warning her about Rebecca for years.
"I saw this coming," Eleanor said, pouring them both tea in her sunny kitchen.
That woman has been isolating Daniel since the wedding.
"And now she's got what she wanted, your house. The house is in Daniel's name," Margaret said slowly.
But I wonder, did Rebecca convince him to transfer it to both their names? Eleanor's eyes narrowed.
"I wouldn't be surprised. That woman is always 3 steps ahead." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Tell me about your nephew."
The real estate attorney. Eleanor smiled. Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret learned several interesting things. First,
Daniel had indeed transferred the house into joint ownership with Rebecca without telling Margaret. Second, Rebecca had been encouraging Daniel to sell it for months.
she wanted the money for a bigger house in the city.
Third, and this was the most interesting part, Rebecca had been having an affair. Margaret's private investigator was expensive but thorough.
The photos were clear.
Rebecca, meeting the same man every Tuesday afternoon at a hotel.
The same man who happened to be Daniel's business partner, Marcus. Margaret sat in her small apartment she'd rented one nearby temporarily and looked at the photos.
She felt no satisfaction,
No triumph,
just a deep, weary sadness for her son.
who would be devastated. But he'd made his choice when he stood silent in that living room. Now Margaret would make hers. She planned carefully, thoughtfully. with the same patience
William had always admired in her. First,
she contacted Daniel's business partner Marcus's wife, Emily. They met for coffee. Margaret showed her the photographs.
Emily's hands shook as she looked at them. I suspected. Emily whispered.
But I didn't want to believe it. Neither did I. Margaret said gently, taking Emily's hand.
What will you do?
I'm going to divorce him, Emily said, her voice growing stronger. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who Marcus is. Margaret nodded.
Rebecca is planning to convince Daniel to sell my beach house.
She wants the money. I think you should know that Marcus has been encouraging this. They've been planning their future together. Emily's jaw tightened. My father is Daniel's biggest client.
He's been keeping Daniel's business afloat for 2 years. Is that so?
Margaret asked softly. 2 days later, Emily's father pulled his business from Daniel's company. He told Daniel exactly why, because his business partner had betrayed his family, and Daniel had been blind to it. Daniel came to Margaret's apartment the next evening.
He looked terrible.
Pale, exhausted. "Mom," he said when she opened the door. "Can we talk?" Margaret let him in. She made him tea, the way she always had when he was troubled.
They sat at her small kitchen table. Emily's husband was having an affair, Daniel said.
With Rebecca, Margaret waited. I confronted her. She admitted it, she said.
His voice broke. She said she never loved me. She married me because I had money and prospects.
She wanted the beach house. She was going to convince me to sell it and take half. I know, Margaret said gently. Daniel looked up, shocked. You knew? I hired an investigator after what happened. I needed to understand who I was really dealing with. Why didn't you tell me?
Would you have believed me? Margaret asked.
Or would you have chosen her again?
Daniel put his head in his hands.
I'm so sorry, Mom. What she said to you that day. I should have defended you. I should have stood up for you. But I was afraid. She threatened to leave me if I didn't choose her over you. And He looked up, tears streaming down his face. I chose wrong. I chose so wrong. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand.
Despite everything, he was still her son. Yes, she said.
You did. And it hurt me more than I can explain.
But you're here now.
And you're seeing clearly now. That's something. I've filed for divorce, Daniel said.
And I want to transfer the beach house back to you. Completely.
Just yours. The way it should be. The house isn't what matters, Margaret said. What matters is that you remember who you are. Who your father raised you to be.
A man with integrity.
With courage. With loyalty to the people who love you. Daniel nodded, wiping his eyes.
Can you forgive me?
Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Forgiveness takes time, Daniel.
Trust takes even longer to rebuild. But I love you.
I always have. And I'm willing to try if you are. I am, he said. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right. Start by being the man your father would be proud of. Margaret said.
That's all I've ever wanted. 3 months later, Margaret stood on the porch of her beach house again. The papers had been finalized.
The house was hers alone, protected now with legal safeguards she'd set up with Eleanor's nephew. Daniel visited every Sunday. They took walks on the beach, slowly rebuilding what had been broken. It would never be the same as it was. Margaret knew.
But perhaps it could be something new.
Something more honest. Rebecca had disappeared after the divorce, taking what little she'd managed to salvage. Marcus had lost everything: his marriage, his business partnership, his reputation. Margaret didn't feel victorious. She felt tired, but also peaceful. She'd learned something important in those painful weeks. Kindness didn't mean being a doormat.
Love didn't require accepting cruelty.
She could be gentle and strong at the same time.
She could forgive while also protecting herself. The ocean stretched before her, endless and patient.
Margaret sat in her chair with her tea, listening to William's jazz records, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt at home. Sometimes she thought, the greatest revenge is simply living well. She'd been called an old leech by someone who couldn't see her value. But Margaret knew her worth now, better than ever before, and knowledge was worth more than any beach house, any relationship, any apology. She was 72 years old, and she was finally completely free. The sun set over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Margaret smiled, lifted her teacup toward the horizon toward William, wherever he was, and whispered, "We did all right, didn't we?" "My love," the waves whispered back their eternal answer. "Yes, you did."